Here we are with Dr. Spork talking all about the EAVYMETAL Warhammer 40K painting guide released by Games Workshop in conjunction with Citadel Miniatures and with the expert advice by Mike McVeigh and many of the talented EAVYMETAL painters back in the day. And Dr. Spork's going to talk us all the way through it, mate. So thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me on, Josh. Always a pleasure, and always good to have a wee chat with you as well. Going through this book properly for this has been an absolute pleasure. These days you can find tons of painting guides all over the internet, but back in the 90s, this was a really valuable resource. It's not one of those quick guides that you got in White Dwarf. It goes far more in depth, and even there it has methods and techniques that I hadn't seen before. It was really interesting to go through. Okay, and as we go inside, there he is, the man himself, Mike McVeigh. He looked really, really young there, but actually I checked this and he had been working for Games Workshop for 7 years by that point. So he must have been like 16. He must have just come straight out of school. Yeah, this is actually not that comprehensive. I would imagine that the fantasy version, which I haven't actually looked at, goes into pinning big metal models together. But there's a couple of interesting little bits at least, and the one of them is the way he attaches the Devastator arms, where he pins the shoulder pad to the gun and the arm to the torso, which is fairly simple bits to do. But pinning everything together is quite tricky. But then you're just left with the two plastic bits, which I thought was a really it's a kind of manageable technique. It takes quite a tricky little bit to stick together so that it'll stay together permanently, and kind of just says, "Oh, you just do it like this, and there you go, you're away." So it's that's what I like about this book. Is there's lots of little things that I'd never heard of, and that are really nice little tips and tricks. Yeah, look at that. That is just a glorious array of miniatures. I think that might be pretty much all of the studio models, the Space Marine models at least. And there's even some of the Monopose Blood Angels from the second edition box set sneaking in right at the back. Personally, which chapter would you pick? You could take one of those chapters.
Look, I've always been a Dark Angel guy, so my Deathwing were the very first. Yeah, the Deathwing, the first models I ever bought the box set.
I would take the Space Wolves because that's what I collected back in the 90s in terms of Space Marines. Just some of the models are absolutely wonderful. I love the fact that they were all pretty much unique models in the Space Wolves. There was no kind of, here's just a Space Marine, paint it to look like a Space Wolf. Even before they were painted, they looked like a Space Wolf. And the Iron Priest in particular, is down in the bottom right-hand corner, that is just such an exquisite model. How to paint a Space Marine. Now, the thing is if you read through this, it's not really changed much in the last 30 years. This is the basics of. I mean, if you use this to paint a Primaris Marine and took it into a Warhammer shop, as they're called these days, no one would bat an eyelid. It would just look exactly the same as everyone else's. So, I mean, sure, everybody likes it a bit grimier these days, and back then the colours were a bit brighter. But if you use the basic techniques here, it's just the same. The Blood Angels. These pages cover what I think are two of the trickiest colours to get them to look just right. And I really enjoy painting red because of that. And I don't enjoy painting black because of that. I can paint red quite well. I always get really frustrated with black, but there's a couple of little tips that I think anyone should bear in mind. The first one, red, I think a lot of people know this, is that you highlight up with orange and yellows because that keeps it looking warmer, and rather than making the red go pink, it kind of, and so it looks really nice, and that's the way to do it. And the other one with the black, which I think does actually work really nicely, is that when you finish painting it, just go back over the middle of the panels again with a bit of pure black, and it just makes sure that if you've maybe kind of, when you've been putting a little bit of a highlighting area, and not an edge highlight, you're just putting a lighter tone over an area of the armor, it means that you've still got that black area in the middle if you've painted over it. So it's just simple little things that make the final model look, it looks really good. It makes a big difference to how it looks when you finish the model. And there is a rare bit of 90s non-metallic metals, which you didn't really see much back then, but Captain Tycho there talks about how to do non-metallic metals, because that's meant to be his gold armor there. And it's interesting, you know, it sort of stands out in the 90s. And I always remember that model. I always thought it looked a bit odd because of that. It looks almost just like he's been painted yellow in the context of all the other models. So Space Wolves, this is what I collected back in the mid to late 90s. I remember painting so many of them. If you want to practice your freehand, well, get some Space Wolves. You know, there's so much kind of freehand to be doing between painting like all the different stripes on the shoulder pads, because every unit has to have different zigzag patterns across the shoulder pads. And then, of course, if you're not using Ragnar Blackmane's Great Company, you've got to paint your own Great Company symbol on the shoulder pad, which can be an absolute nightmare. But Mike McVeigh actually talks about a really simple trick for doing that, where he takes the kind of standard transfers and applies them, and then uses them as like a template to paint over the top. So you've got a nice, good starting point. It's just tracing over basically with your paint, and you can see it on those. There's 3 shoulder pads there that he's done exactly that with. So you know, it's taking these seemingly complex patterns and symbols and showing the reader that you don't need training in classic art or years of practice. You can just do it. There are just little tips and tricks. These diagrams on the right show exactly what I'm talking about in terms of how they're good at explaining how to do these patterns in a simple fashion. And these are just the kind of standard Space Marine squad markings with your arrow for your tactical squad, and there's like a little triangle. I think is that an assault squad? Is it? I think so. Can't remember. But it just breaks them down, you know, the way you paint that arrow, you draw the cross, and then you fill them in, and then, you know, it's a really good book for doing that kind of techniques. Another wonderful captain model there with the Ultramarine captain. I don't like Ultramarines very much, but I've always had a soft spot for that. I think it's because it had some character. I find that because they're the kind of default chapter, most of the time they look a bit bland, whereas that one, it's got a lot of the Roman kind of gear on and a little broadsword and stuff like that. I think it's but really nice. What I found really interesting is that they talk about painting the gold on him and using a method that I've not seen before, where he uses a blend of gold paint and yellow ink painted over a white base coat. And this means that it highlights the gold and yellow ink is translucent on the higher areas, so it gives you this kind of subtle highlight. It's basically a recipe for gold contrast paint almost, which as far as I'm aware, Games Workshop have never actually produced anything like that. So Mike McVeigh, maybe he's got the rights to it. I don't know. Maybe he came up with it. But I love looking at galleries like this of brightly coloured Space Marine chapters to inspire you to come up with your own. I mean, that's really, I don't think they're expecting anybody to like have a legion of Eagle Warriors, but it lets you realise that you can just go wild and do your own thing. And that was something that I really liked about the 90s Games Workshop thing, was they really wanted you to go and do your own thing with it. And that table on the right-hand page there is, where it talks about, here's your base coat, here's your covering coat, here's the colours you can use for highlighting. There's so much of that out there today. So many times you see people going, what's your recipe for painting these things? But back in the 90s, this was a really valuable resource, so that you knew what you were going to be doing. You know what colours to go to the shop and buy, because you couldn't just order them online and things like that. So that little table is actually, something that would have been really, really useful back then. That's another wonderful army. I collected orcs back in the 90s, and absolutely loved painting them up in all the bright colours. I love the fact that you can really see in this picture that all the studio scenery is clearly designed with an eye on displaying the miniatures. You know, you've got all these little cutouts that they all perfectly sit in, and the ruined cathedral that you see a lot of the time is basically just a shelf. And I think these jungle trees at the back are often massively overlooked in favor of the much more iconic spiky cactuses. I think they're really simple. I think they're in one of the War Games terrain book, maybe. How you make them, and it is dead easy, dead quick, and really effective. I'm going to make some for myself, I think, rather than making spiky cactuses. Just do something a bit different to other people. And so this book is full of these 4-step painting guides that I always remember when I was younger. They were a bit more rest of the sodding owl, you know, where you'd go ba, 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 and then suddenly it becomes the finished, you know, suddenly the last stage, you're like, how did you do all that? But they don't seem so bad now that I'm older. I don't know if it's just if I'm a bit more experienced painter, so I've got a bit more of a kind of, I just look at it and go, oh, there we go, or what. But yeah, they don't seem as bad as my old wizened mind would like to think. This guide for the Evil Sun's clan symbol is, in my opinion, one of the best bit of this book. This is a detailed and complex bit of freehand to do. You know, it's really nice thing to do, but very, very intimidating for a lot of people to even think about doing, let alone actually try it. And they've broken it down into really nice, simple steps and demystified the whole process. And I think the real talent of a lot of what is written within this book is not just showing the painters how to do these tricky pieces, but explaining them in such a way that dispels that fear that someone might have of just trying to paint something like this. Because, you know, realistically, anyone can paint that. But if they just follow, but you just need to follow these steps, and then it's done, and it's nice and simple, and there's no fuss. And I think that's one of the really useful things about this book. Blood axes. That was what I collected back. That was my main orc clan. You know, you always threw in bits and pieces of the others. You know, your looters would be death skulls and things like that. But the main part of them were blood axes. And it was always really difficult to get reference material for painting them because they seem to be the least popular orc clans, like back in the 90s. You know, so I think I remember using the 2nd edition Imperial Guard Codex. I always liked the fact that they were basically just a piss take of the Imperium. So you could do that. You could just take the Imperial Guard Codex. I think the 2nd edition one, the Imperial Guard Codex, has just this absolutely huge section on various kind of lurid and bizarre camo schemes that are meant for the Imperial Guard, but they're absolutely perfect for sticking on your blood axes. Did you ever watch The Prisoner with Patrick McGoohan?
No, I can't say I have.
Okay, well, they're in Port Merion, and there's all sorts of weird kind of British seaside patterns everywhere. And the brightly coloured stripes and patterns of the freebooters of this kind of like era always reminded me of The Prisoner. It's like the orcs had broken into the costume department. I'd love to get a handful of these miniatures just to have a go at painting them up, because it just seems like you just like kind of randomly machine gun primary colors and patterns onto them. But they actually, because of that, they look like quite a recognizable unit within an orc army, because they are just this kind of mad, brightly colored unit right in the middle. They're basically the Harlequins of the orc army at this point. It's the same kind. Another glorious sight that army is. The colours and the various models. I love the fact that the Eldar armies are very much non-uniform, to the point where the orc army earlier in the book looks much more cohesive. It evokes the individuality of each person within the culture, despite it being a discipline force, while the orcs are a bit more of a disorganized rabble, but their tribal nature means that the average orc doesn't want to stand out from the crowd too much. So, and that avatar of Khaine, we'll talk about him in a minute when we get to that page, but he's one of my favorite models. This book actually covers things that are a bit more than just how to paint the model with your shading and your highlighting. In quite a few places, like this page, it discusses how painting areas in certain ways can draw the eye. Here they talk about the contrast of the bright white helmet on the dark blue armor creates a nice focal point on a model. This is starting to think about how to compose your paint on your model beyond just painting it, and how people will look at it. And it shows that painting models reaches a level of artistry that I think is often overlooked by people who assume it is just fancy colouring in. And there's also the stripes on the helmet there, the kind of just the yellow and red ones. He uses a really interesting technique there, where he's painted it all yellow and he's given it a little orange wash to do the shading on the yellow. But then to do the red, he's just used thinned red paint and painted straight over the yellow. And because the yellow underneath shows through a bit on the higher areas, it gives a little orange highlight. So it means you don't need to do anything else. It's just a really interesting, quick way to add red over yellow without having to do too much extra work. Spiders. And here he talks, the warp spiders, he talks about how the main colours are black, white and red, but he decided to use green on the model to pick out certain areas and make them stand out from the main colour scheme. He calls it a relief colour, I think. And talking about using colours like this, even in a fairly basic way, is such a rare thing to be doing 30 years ago. It wasn't this book wasn't released too long after John Blanche was writing his Blanchitsu column, and how the best thing to do with your miniature when you'd finish painting it is to give it several good coats of household varnish. What he particularly liked about that was that it gradually yellowed over time.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly that was written by John Blanche in White Dwarf.
Right.
As I already mentioned, this is one of my absolute favourite models. I got one off eBay for about £8 a couple of years back and stripped and repainted it, made a scenic base for it. I think you've seen it yourself, haven't you, Josh?
I have, mate.
And even though it's like an absolutely meticulous, beautiful model by Jez Goodwin, known for getting everything just so, you can still see places where you can see the sculpting marks on it, which I think this is probably that kind of end of Rogue Trader into second edition was where you still got a bit of that, and it makes it feel like an actual little bit of art more so than a lot of later stuff that just feels a bit too clinical. And it actually inspired me to a certain extent to get to have a go at sculpting models with green stuff and milliput and sculpting tools rather than just doing everything on a computer. And it's great to have this really in-depth article about the individual one miniature and about the whole process from start to finish that Mike's gone through. I didn't have this book when I painted mine, but I was pleased that I had approached it in a similar way. He talks about, you can't do all of the armor at once. You got to start and you got to make sure you remember your recipe and as you go along. I didn't go to quite the lengths that he did. I think he talks about doing 10 stages of blended highlights and like more than half a dozen layers of glazing just on the armor panels. So yeah. I don't have the patience to go quite that far. Yeah. Maybe I'll try and get another one and have a go at that, but we'll see. I don't know if I've got the time at the moment. What I found interesting about the Harlequins page is actually he spends a lot of time talking about restricting your colours and patternings with the Harlequins, because obviously it's quite tempting to go completely overboard with tons of colours and patterns absolutely everywhere. But I think this is really just good advice for painting any miniatures. You pick 2 or 3 colours for the scheme for 90% of the miniature, and don't overcomplicate things. when you're painting a miniature in kind of these vibrant 90s styles, it's very easy to get carried away because you can have quite a lot of fun with it. But if you set yourself some simple boundaries, like he talks about here, to work within, you can make it can make you more creative because you've got to figure out how you're going to do things. It forces you to really think about your color scheme and how it translates into your model. I think it's just generally good advice, but obviously he's just worried about the Harlequins, and of course, absolutely glorious models there being painted in that very 90s style. The Eldar Dreadnought here is another one he talks about. He says in there that every single one of the little patterns on it is actually a decal that you could get back then, like a little transfer. That he has then just gone over and added a little bit of highlighting and a little bit of shading to make them pop out from the model more, which it's really impressive because that looks like someone spent so much time doing freehanding all over it just because the transfers aren't flat color anymore. Simple method. And I just want to say as well, that jet bike is still the best Eldar jet bike they've ever produced. The early metal jet bikes are great. The sense of speed in that model, with the shape of the fairing and the pose of the biker, it's far better than any of the plastics that have come afterwards. I don't know if you did. Was it because that's Rogue Trader model, the actual second edition plastic Eldar jet bikes. I think they were the Eldar were sat very upright. They didn't look like they were going fast at all. That guy looks like he's barely holding on. Speaking of Rogue Trader models, here are the Imperial Guard plastics. And personally, I think that Games Workshop needs to completely do an updated version of all of these Rogue Trader Imperial Guardsmen. In similar way that they did, probably for the Horus Heresy would be quite fun because they did the RTB-01 plastic Space Marines. They basically did a new version of those for the new Horus Heresy box. Well, I say new, it's a few years back for the current Horus Heresy box set. And I think they did a great job with those. I think they look fantastic. They've got really nice style. They're one of the few sets of models that I think Games Workshop has really absolutely nailed in the last 10 years. I think they're really good. And again, these ones also, pretty much everything here could do with a nice update and released in Horus Heresy. I would probably buy tons of them. And it's difficult for Games Workshop to get money out of me unless they're re-releasing a 30-year-old model these days. But if they updated, like the Ogrins, the Commanders, the Commissar, that Commissar there is actually possibly my favorite. The one down at the bottom holding the book. Yep. Possibly my favorite Commissar that Games Workshop have ever released. Even the Imperial Assassin down there, he could do with a little update. Do some Imperial Guard for Horus Heresy. The squats. This is one of those peaks into the mists of what could have been. Sadly, never got these two unreleased models down on the bottom corner. I really like them, and I've seen a few pictures of the other unreleased squat models. I think they were taking them in a really interesting direction, bit more Viking, a bit more Celtic, as you can see from the knots and things like that, and away from actually things like that biker up in the top corner who that's a very Rogue Trader feeling model, and onto this kind of more kind of vibrant stylized version. And of course, I suppose what I should just do is go buy some from Chris over on Ontos Games. I know you're a big fan of his kind of inspired by Ontos
was brilliant. Yeah, he's fantastic. Those ranges are lovely. Yeah, really are nice. Yeah, I've
got one that he gave me at Bring Out Your Lead last year. He had a pocket full of squats.
As you do.
And he came over. We'd been chatting, and he just came over to me and said, "I like you." And he gave me a squat. I was really pleased.
Like Tom Baker from Doctor Who.
Jelly baby.
So we're looking at the Tyranid army here, and I know Dr. Spork will comment further on that, but I just wanted to say that, I've actually painted a lot of these old models in a recent commission for my good friend Carnifex in Australia with all the metal gene stealers, and I used I know you'll be really shocked to hear this, Dr. Spork, some contrast medium. And I know, mate. You'll be shock and awe, isn't it? Yeah, but it worked really well. And I've got to say, and I know this won't cover it in this particular painting article that they wrote back in 1994, but yeah, contrast medium and inks, and I used some Citadel Air. It's a purple. It's a really, really nice one too. And they just worked an absolute treat on this luminous kind of flesh and the chitinous armor, or whatever they call it, on the bodies, and yeah, making some nice purple blues and stuff like that. It just worked an absolute treat painting these models.
Well, he does talk on these pages about the fact that these Gene Stealer models are actually really great for using washes on. They had lots of lovely detail. They were really sharp. He also talks about how to really quickly paint them, because he talks about painting his Space Hulk set, where he's like, I had 20 of these to paint. I didn't want to spend forever doing them. So there's actually like a quick guide to painting Gene Stealers as fast as possible for anyone who's still got an unpainted 30-year-old. I suppose it doesn't need to be the 30-year-old Space Hulk set. I'm sure it applies equally to any of the new Space Hulk sets as well. So.
And Chaos. Now, Chaos is, as we talked about before, it's sort of overlooked, sadly. I think that's a real shame, because there was a lot of potential where they could really go to town on all the different patron gods and all the different color schemes, especially like tackling things like pink. And reds, I know, have been covered, of course, the Blood Angels, so you could apply a lot of those techniques directly into your factions of Chaos. But Dr. Spork, do you have any commentary on the Chaos section at all?
It would have been, it is a very sparse section at the end of this book. It would have been nice to maybe see something about painting up the Rogue Trader Chaos Dreadnought or something like that. And of course, it's really nice models that are in here, and they're exquisitely painted. One of the little interesting things that he does mention is he talks again when he's doing the World Eaters about using green as a relief color again on them. So he's done the red and the gold, and then he adds a bit of green in there. But he also says that it helps make the red feel brighter.
Now, just a quick comment here, because again, through the EavyLead painting studios, I've had the pure pleasure of painting some of these models. The Death Guard, which I'm doing now, which will be revealed in a future video and battle report, playing with Carnifex's Plague Marines and stuff like that. He's got here loads of these sort of old Road Trader models, which I absolutely love, and 1,000 Suns, which both of those were my favorite units to paint. I absolutely adored painting those old models, and I think Jez Goodwin's Hallmark 4 Chaos Marines are my favorites of all the miniatures he's ever done for 40K. I think they're hands down my favorite. I love the Eldar, but I really love those 4 iconic miniatures, which I think they were released not so long ago on Made to Order, weren't they?
I think they did a resin version, did they?
Oh, did they?
Metal.
Oh,
yeah,
my goodness.
That happens a lot of the time. You see them and I go, resin? No, I'm okay. Thank you.
Sorry. Bye. And finally, we've got the 40K banners. Now, this is something that's quite interesting. I don't know if other painting guides had this, but they had obviously scans of the original banners they painted in the studio, and they just put those in the back cover just to supplement a few pages there, which were really, really cool, because, they gave you essentially the exact copy that they used in the studio, which I found really funny, because they've got like a World Eaters banner, which is clearly the Goblins banner from Warhammer Fantasy. I don't know where they got that one from, but that was a really funny one. Well, I think that pretty much sums up the book, mate. I want to thank you again, Dr. Spork, for covering it with us, with me, and for our listeners and viewers at the Crown of Command Games. And I hope you enjoyed covering it with me.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, well done to anyone who got this far listening to me prattle on, but thank you for listening.
Mate, it's always a pleasure, and I'm sure we'll find something else in the future to cover together.
Yeah,
so until then,
great.
Take care, my friend, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, you too. Thank you very much.